My name is Steve. This is a Duke Law ACLU event. We have two speakers today to talk about voter ID laws. Clare Barnett, staff attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and Jennifer Frye, the associate director of Democracy, North Carolina. Clare grew up in Raleigh and received her BA in American Studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But that's okay because she got her law degree here. At Duke, Clare was a member of the Duke Law Innocence Project and a staff editor of the Duke Forum for Law and Social Justice. She became involved in social justice in the Triangle area as an intern with the North Carolina Innocence Commission, Legal Aid of North Carolina, and Disability Rights North Carolina. She also worked as a research assistant for the Duke Center for Criminal Justice and Professional Responsibility and the UNC School of Government. Jennifer was a Democracy Summer Student Organizer in 2003 and served on Democracy NC's Board of Directors before becoming part of the organizing staff in January 2006. She is an alumnus of the Public Allies North Carolina Leadership Development Program and previously worked in gun violence and homelessness prevention. She holds a BA in political science and German from UNC. That's okay. As associate director, she manages the daily operations of Democracy NC, participates heavily in our organizing leadership training work, their organizing and training work, and is responsible for their community outreach in the Durham area. Please join me in welcoming them.
Good afternoon. Can y'all hear us okay? I want to first say that I think you have a great basketball team here at Duke, and I mean that sincerely. I'm not a rabid UNC fan. I'm a sports fan, and I like good sports, and I think Duke has a good team, so that should make things a little easier for us. So Claire and I are going to sort of trade off here. I'll start off, but just by giving some background. How many of you have been following the voter ID legislation in North Carolina? Raise your hands. Okay, some of you. So I'll try not to spend too much time on background, but just to get you up to speed on where we are now. Voter ID first appeared during the 2011 legislative session. After the 2010 election in North Carolina, for the first time in over 100 years, the Republicans held a majority in both the House and the Senate. They had a veto-proof majority in the Senate, but not in the House. But they did pass a voter ID law back in 2011. It was House Bill 351. It was one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country, modeled after Georgia and Indiana's laws. And at the time, we had a Democratic governor in office, Governor Perdue. When that bill got to her desk, she vetoed it. The Senate quickly overrode her veto, but the House was never able to get the 5 Democratic votes they needed to override the veto, so the bill stopped there. The 2012 election gave the Republicans a bigger majority, and now they have not only a veto-proof majority, but also a governor who has said that he supports voter ID. So they're back again trying to pass a bill. They did not. So initially, before the session started, they indicated they might do this rather quickly. So we were sort of anticipating that we would see a voter ID bill as early as February. However, they appeared to slow down a little bit, and part of the reason why, according to them, is there is such strong opposition from groups like Democracy North Carolina and other voting rights groups. But it's also true that they were looking around the country, I think, at the challenges happening to voter ID laws passed in other states and wondering what they need to do here in North Carolina to pass a law that would withstand a legal challenge, which Claire can talk more about. So we're at a point now where the House Election Law Committee, where this bill will probably originate, has had a public hearing. They did that last week in Raleigh, and it was very well attended. I don't know exactly how many people were there, but it was probably close to 175. Most people there were speaking out against the law. There were some people speaking in support of it. Right after that public hearing, they had an expert panel come testify to their committee. Bob Hall, our executive director, was among those who testified, as was Allison Riggs from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And they wanted to hear from election experts, both for and against voter ID, what some of the challenges were, and specifically, if they're going to pass a law, which they intend to do, what should the considerations be? So the experts gave their testimony, and I think this week they might be inviting them back one more time or have some other people speak to them, but they are saying they're planning to have a bill filed by the end of this month. We still don't know what that bill looks like. what happened right before the public hearing was that some Democrats in the legislature went ahead and filed their own version of a voter ID bill. And they did that thinking that they could put in a more moderate proposal and hopefully get some bipartisan cooperation there. I don't know that that has happened. I know that some of the ideas in that bill the Democrats put forward were ideas that Republicans had been talking about, but it remains to be seen what the bill that they'll push forward will actually look like. So that's where we are.
Well, thank you, Jen, for that nice summary. And I won't tell you where my basketball allegiances lie, since I probably won't win any fans in this room. So just to start out with, my organization, Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and other organizations like Democracy NC are really interested in the effect that voter ID is going to have on turnout, especially for groups that are traditionally have been disenfranchised. We're talking about people of color, low-income people, people experiencing homelessness. And when we think about voter ID, one of the first things to consider is what is it designed to prevent? And the General Assembly has said that they want to prevent voter fraud, in-person voter fraud, and there's this great fear that there are thousands of people coming in, busloads to the polls trying to impersonate people when they vote. But the data we've had, and Jen can probably speak more to this, is that the State Board of Elections in North Carolina released a report ranging from 2000 to 2010, and it analyzed every time that a in-person voter fraud had been referred to a district attorney's office for prosecution. And the number that they got out of that 10-year report was 2. And just to put it in a little more perspective, that is one person in 2008 out of 4.35 million voters. And so it's against this context that I want to talk a little bit about what are the legal ramifications for a bill like this, and what would a bill have to do to survive a challenge under federal law or state law. And there are 3 main ways that someone might challenge a voter ID law. The first is under the Voting Rights Act. Have you all been following the Shelby case in the Supreme Court at all? Well, Shelby is a case that's currently challenging part of the Voting Rights Act, which is Section 5. And North Carolina is partially covered under Section 5. There are 40 counties in North Carolina, mostly in the east, but also including nearby Greensboro and Guilford County, that are subject to preclearance for any decision that they make that regarding a change in voting. And Section 5 requires that whatever change a jurisdiction makes in voting, that they don't have a discriminating purpose or a retrogressive effect. And so this is really significant for something like voter ID, because for as long as we have Section 5, hopefully into the future, but we don't know right now, they have to make sure that the voter ID laws aren't going to suppress voter turnout. And so there's a similar case, a case in Texas, where they had a bill that looked very similar to the bill that Jen was talking about in 2011 in North Carolina. And it was a photo ID only bill. And what the district court, or Texas took the bill to the DC District Court, and they wanted them to rule that it did not violate Section 5 so they could implement it. But it turns out they can't implement it because they found that the free ID that Texas was supposedly offering voters actually created burdens for voters of color and low-income voters, because it takes resources to get to the DMV's office. It takes resources to get to the State Board of Elections. If you're trying to have a new voter ID, if you don't drive, if you don't have a driver's license, if you have limited means, it often poses a lot of challenges to get something like a photo ID, even if it's free. And so based on that, Texas found that the burdens on minority voters, who are traditionally more likely to be low-income voters as well, were too great to justify passing the voter ID bill under Section 5. And Jen, do you want to talk a little bit more about the burdens on voters?
Well, I wanted to say something first about the fraud piece. So 5 votes per million or 2 votes per million or whatever the statistic is, That's for voter fraud in general. Voter impersonation is the rarest type of voter fraud out there. Democracy North Carolina and the other organizations working against voter ID, we agree with the supporters of voter ID that fraud is bad, that we want to prevent that we want to prosecute it where it happens. We agree that the integrity of elections is important. If we don't have that, people won't participate in the process. Where we disagree is on what constitutes fraud, how widespread it is, and the best ways to prevent it. With voter impersonation being so rare, it's hard to understand why the first bill that a policymaker would go to is something like voter ID, which only prevents in-person voter fraud, where I would go and pretend to be another voter. That's the only kind of voter fraud that voter ID would address. Especially, I think, in a case like this where you're talking about who doesn't have ID, and the State Board of Elections also released numbers on voters they tried to match with the DMV database, so active registered voters that they tried to match to see if they could find how many of them actually lack a state-issued driver's license or ID card. And the numbers that came back were pretty staggering. Over 506,000 active registered voters couldn't be matched. Now, Civitas, which is an organization on the other side that supports voter ID, says, those numbers are largely inflated. They've done their own research, and they say, according to their research, that it's actually only 2% of North Carolina voters who are registered who might lack photo ID. So sticking with that, saying that they're right, that the State Board of Election numbers are largely inflated. If only 2% of voters in North Carolina don't have ID, that's still over 120,000 registered voters. So the rate of voters who don't have ID is 10,000 per 1 million voters, which is much, much higher than the 5 votes per million they're saying are fraudulent every year. So you have to weigh, I think, especially when it comes to rights like voting, which are so fundamental to our democracy, which all of us feel is a right that we have. You have to weigh what a law is going to do to suppress voting with what it would do to protect voting. And our argument is you're much more likely to suppress votes than actually prevent any fraud with this bill. So we really need to back up and take a broader view on this whole issue and work to find solutions that will actually accomplish the things they say they want to accomplish, making elections more secure while maintaining that they're free and accessible for everybody. So that's something I think, unfortunately, that hasn't been part of this debate. It's been ignored and pushed under the rug. I mean, Speaker Tillis recently said to the media, well, this isn't really about voter fraud, it's about the perception of voter fraud. People perceive that fraud happens, so they don't have confidence in their election system, so they don't have confidence in their government, and that's why we need this. I think that's a highly flawed argument. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't really get in arguments very often. I try to avoid them when I can. But to me, that doesn't make any sense at all. To me, I can give you an example of a different problem I think causes real challenges with our election integrity, and that's money in politics. There's definitely a perception out there, a wide perception. 80+% of the people in this country feel like corporations and big money donors have way too much influence in politics. Yet what have we done to curtail that problem? Have we passed public financing in North Carolina or any other state? I mean, you can't tell me that we're talking about election integrity here when we're focusing so narrowly on something like voter ID. And to the point about getting an ID, so what the supporters of voter ID have in their favor is that this is a largely popular election reform, generally because voters, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats or unaffiliated, people do think there's some sort of voter fraud that's out there. They don't understand what it means or exactly what it is, but they think it's out there. So public opinion is, why not have a voter ID? Everybody's got a photo ID. You need it to drive. You need it to buy alcohol. You need it to cash a check. You need it to get on a plane. These are the common things that you hear from people who aren't trying to suppress anybody's votes, but really don't see why it's such a big deal. But again, I think in this case, especially when we're talking about something like voting rights, we have to look at who would have the biggest burden when it comes to this law. And it's the people who, to get a free ID, even if free ID were provided, would have to track down a birth certificate. And if that birth certificate had a different name, if they'd gotten married and their name changed, they'd have to have their marriage license to prove that they're that person on the birth certificate. And when you start adding up that cost of each point in the process, if you don't have your Social Security card, you have to have ID to get that. When I worked in homelessness prevention, I tried helping people who had just come out of the justice system, or people who had never had a driver's license, people who wanted to get ID so they could work, so they could get out of homelessness, so they could feed their families. And I spent so much time trying to help people track down their birth certificates. It's much harder than you would think. And then at every point in that process, there's some cost involved to the individual to get the ID they need to get ID. So we have to keep that in mind, and that's what I keep doing that, Claire was referring to.
Yeah, so I mean, a number that you really have to consistently think about when you're thinking about voter ID in North Carolina, or reaching out to your representatives to express that you don't believe in something like voter ID, if that's your own opinion, is that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of voters, the elderly, people of color, who we know for a fact do not have a photo ID at this time. And we only know 2 people who have actually been referred to prosecution in the past decade for fraud-related offenses. So one of the reasons that we think that the General Assembly might be taking their time with a bill like this is because since Shelby is a case in front of the Supreme Court right now challenging the validity of Section 5, the bill that they're going to have to put forward right now with Section 5 requirements, it's very unlikely that a pure photo ID bill with no other exceptions is going to pass, muster under Section 5 scrutiny. It hasn't really so far in any of the states that have brought them that are covered by Section 5. And in states that have had voter IDs, like South Carolina, and they passed theirs, they got theirs through only because, in addition to the photo ID that they required, they had an exception. And if you could say that you had a reasonable burden to getting a voter ID or a photo ID to vote, that you could sign an affidavit saying that you are who you say you are and you can vote. Without that, it wouldn't have passed Section 5 pre-clearance. Now, what our legislature, I think, would like is a pure photo ID bill. So it'll be interesting to watch the timing to see what they're going to do, and if they're going to pass a law that has to be pre-cleared under Section 5, or the way that pre-clearance works is they don't have to pre-clear it until they want to enact it. So if they say we want to enact it in 2014, then they don't have to submit it for pre-clearance until roughly about 90 days before is usually what they do. So they might sit on it for a while. But that is something just to think about as law students, is what the U.S. Supreme Court is deciding right now may change the way that you get to vote when you go to the polls. So it's an interesting topic. Mm-hmm. Other states around here that have photo ID bills that are covered by Section 5 include Virginia. But Virginia's bill is, they ask for photo ID, but they also take more documents like bills that have your proof of name and address, or any other type of document that you can use to get your registration to vote. So it's really a pretty liberal law, and it's not one that we expect to see coming out of the General Assembly, but we could be pleasantly surprised. And so going to the burdens that we've been talking about before, the other way to challenge this law is under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that minority voters have to be protected from any practices and procedures that might diminish their ability to vote because of their race or because of any other protected class status. And so under Section 2, we haven't had a successful Section 2 lawsuit in the country before about voter ID, but it is likely because given the much higher impact on people of color, there's a lot of evidence to show that this is kind of a traditional way of disenfranchising voters. It's the new wave of disenfranchisement. So just like there were poll taxes before or literacy tests, Section 2 analysis takes that all into account. It looks at the history of the jurisdiction in which they're trying to pass this, and if they've had similar laws in the past that have been intended to disenfranchise minority voters, and seeing if this is part of the trend that is trying to disenfranchise them as well. And the final way to challenge a voter ID law, in which the burdens versus the state's interest really come into play, is obviously constitutional law and constitutional grounds. The Supreme Court has considered voter ID before a facial challenge to it in the case Crawford v. Marion County, which was about Indiana's voter ID law. And in that, they applied a test which is less than strict scrutiny, even though voter ID voting is a fundamental right. But you are allowed to have some administrative regulations on voting just because, I mean, it's a bureaucratic process at the end of the day, even though your right to go to the ballot box is a fundamental right. And so when they analyzed constitutional rights in the Crawford case in Indiana, they looked at whether or not the harms that came to the voters were balanced by the state's interests in having integrity of elections. But the problem with the Crawford case is they couldn't find anyone who actually didn't have a voter ID or didn't have a photo ID or had difficult means of getting one. So facial challenges are difficult under the current Supreme Court precedent, but there is room for as-applied challenges and more class action type challenges as well, which collect the voters, such as elderly people who don't drive, or people experiencing homelessness, or other people who have common reasons about why they don't have photo ID, and they can bring a suit forward. The challenge is, given that there aren't very many instances of voter fraud, whether or not that meets the state's or whether that meets the burden test of showing that the burden on these voters who have to go get a photo ID is justified.
I know that we want to get to Q&A, and I always like discussion more than just talking at people anyway. I have a couple other points that I could make, but I want to just pause here to see if there are any burning questions, if y'all like to go into more of a discussion mode than just sitting here listening to us. Anybody have questions or comments? Really?
I have a question, but I don't know if you want to do it now or
Go for it.
We kind of haven't talked about this, but I was wondering if there were any, I think there was like a Pennsylvania governor who said that Romney would win Pennsylvania because of the voter ID law there, and a lot of people jumped on that as basically an indication that Republicans were using this as a way to disenfranchise people purposely because these individuals usually vote for Democrats instead of Republicans. And I was wondering if in North Carolina you had heard, I doubt you've really heard anything on the record, but if you've heard anything off the record regarding this alternative motivation for why certain politicians would want this kind of law put in place.
We haven't heard that kind of language used in North Carolina. In fact, I feel like the North Carolina Republican Party, particularly Representative David Lewis, who's sort of leading this in the House, they've been very intentional about saying we're not trying to disenfranchise anyone. This is purely about election integrity and restoring confidence in government. That said, I think it's important to contextualize our voter ID fight in North Carolina with what's happening in the rest of the country. These laws, again, they started popping up most recently and quickly after the 2008 election, after the 2010 election, actually, the midterm, where you had a lot of changeover in state legislatures across the country. And I think that it's also important to note that some of these early bills that were passed, I think including North Carolina's original bill, were modeled after legislation suggested by the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a conservative organization that proposes all sorts of legislation to conservative lawmakers. So there was definitely a coordinated effort across the country to pass voter ID. What the intentions are of that is where you can get into an argument. You know, a lot of people think it has highly partisan intentions, but regardless of that, what we're saying is the impact matters far more than the intention here. Even if your intention is not to discriminate based on race, gender, age, or political party affiliation, that's exactly what voter ID does.
I mean, I think some support for the position that it is motivated by that is total bootstrapping. When they say that a people don't trust the system because there's so much fraud. That's because they've ginned it up over the last few years. I mean, is a cottage industry of people saying, oh my gosh, the voter fraud, we let Black Panthers outside the poll, all these kind of totally insane things. So then, you know, and these are only Republicans doing this, so it's pretty obvious. But I think a sort of interesting question is, what was the impact of the voter ID laws in states like Pennsylvania, and that whether it actually may have had the opposite effect of getting people riled up about wanting to be able to vote, and when people feel like something's being taken away, often they treasure it more than when they had it. So I know that's sort of a controversial point, but.
Do you want to talk about turnout? I have some information about turnout in Georgia because, again, supporters of voter ID, one of their counter arguments to our argument against the legislation is, you keep saying that voter ID is going to disenfranchise people, but show us someone who doesn't have an ID. You know, we called all these voters and they all had ID. And they point to Georgia as an example of a state that had an ID law where turnout actually increased. We have reason to think that that's not exactly true. So to start, it's hard to compare turnout between two elections. Even if you're comparing one presidential election with another, like 2004 turnout in Georgia versus 2008 turnout in Georgia. Yeah, 2008 turnout in Georgia, even though they had the ID law, was much higher than in 2004. But 2008 turnout across the board was much higher because it was such an energetic election. So it's hard to say, you know, voter ID had no dampening effect on the electorate. Georgia research compares two non-presidential years to 2006 when there was no photo ID requirement, and 2010 after the law was in effect. They say that turnout was higher in 2010 compared to 2006 because, you know, look, voter ID didn't have an impact. But again, you have a similar situation where in 2006 in that off-year election, there wasn't a Senate race. In 2010 there was. So in any year where you have that dynamic, where there's a hotter race or more interest overall in the election, turnout is going to be higher. If you compare Georgia with North Carolina, and this is something else that supporters of voter ID do, saying, you know, our demographics are very similar. I heard one of I think it was the guy from Civitas say that Georgia's turnout was higher than North Carolina's in 2012, but that's not what our numbers show. On average, for the last, you know, several decades, North Carolina's turnout has been on average 4 points higher than Georgia. And if you look at 2012, the most recent election, when Georgia had voter ID and North Carolina didn't, our turnout was even higher than that average. So, I mean, does that mean you can make an argument that actually does suppress the vote? I think a lot more research needs to be done on whether voter ID suppresses the vote, but it's hard research to do. Another thing that proponents of voter ID will say is, you know, only 26,000 people in Georgia or Indiana applied for the free ID that you can get. So clearly, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of people who need ID. Our counter to that is, if people hear that there's an ID requirement, they're not even going to bother to go through the process because that barrier seems insurmountable to them. So, you know, you look at the number of people who show up to the polls and actually don't have ID. How does that number compare to the people who ask for free ID? So, I mean, it's hard to really vet out the impact. But again, I think that if you're going back to the root of the supposed problem, voter fraud, it's much less likely that fraud will happen than you're likely to disenfranchise an eligible voter, based on most numbers I've seen.
Yeah, and I mean, to go along with Jen's point, voter turnout in Georgia, I mean, they're still doing analysis to see what the turnout numbers really are in proportion to population growth, but I think it's been substantiated so far by voter ID opponents that the increases in voter turnout in Georgia are not proportional to other southern states. So there's some evidence that it is being suppressed. In addition, in Pennsylvania was under an injunction, so they couldn't even implement the voter ID law in 2012. So maybe the election would have been different. But for, you know, the reasons that Pennsylvania gave was they weren't ready to implement this law. It requires a lot of voter education in order to, you know, pass it fairly and to implement it fairly. Also, they were supposedly giving out the free photo IDs, but they didn't really have an established administrative procedure for how to get people IDs, how to get people who don't have transportation to places where they can get photo IDs. So there are a lot of, administrative hurdles to implementing it, even assuming that the law is good to go on its face for constitutional reasons. Mm-hmm. And another thing to note about the way that the voter ID in North Carolina is working is that cost is a huge issue that the proponents of voter ID don't want to talk about. But I think the numbers in Georgia, and I could be wrong about this, but the implementation of the free voter ID program has cost Georgia taxpayers about $11 million. So, I mean, it's $11 million for a instance of voter fraud that they haven't really been able to substantiate. And I know in North Carolina there are a lot of things, including making elections more secure and more fair, that we'd like to be spending our money on, like cleaning up the administrative records, making sure that everyone is accurately registered and able to vote, where they're supposed to vote. That money could be going to things like that, which are documented problems that we actually have. But instead, we're probably going to be pouring millions of dollars into making sure that people have photo IDs so that they can go to vote and are who they say they are, even though there's not really much evidence that anyone's ever voted and hasn't been who they said they were. So.
This is a quick follow-up. I think that's a really good point, that there are some other reasons, problems with the election system. Has anybody been talking about the lines? I know that you don't have to talk about this now if you don't want, but I was through voter protection at polls and there were like lines that were like 4 hours long. I mean, isn't that a problem? Is anyone talking about that kind of thing? Or is it all, I mean, it's obviously partisan, but I mean, let's be honest. If all we're talking about is a voter ID and not how to allow people to vote.
Yeah, and it certainly raises questions again about intention and, the long lines, no one is talking about that specifically. This year, they have been quiet on this, but back when they first were trying to pass voter ID, the leadership in the General Assembly was at the same time talking about cutting early voting, ending same-day registration, and banning voting on Sundays. These are all things that have been implemented in the last decade that you have to give major credit to for increasing North Carolina's voter turnout. North Carolina historically languished in the bottom 15 states in terms of voter turnout. When we started implementing early voting, same-day registration, and these other proactive positive reforms, we started climbing that ladder in terms of turnout. So they've had a clear positive effect on participation. So why are we trying to simultaneously pass voter ID and cut the things that we know have increased turnout in North Carolina if we're really interested in making sure most voters, as many voters as possible, can participate in the process? I think it's interesting to note as well, speaking of other election problems, there were at least 2,500 voters in North Carolina who were given the wrong ballots in 2012 because of complexities related to the redistricting case. So that's at least 2,500 voters, and that was just in 7 counties that were studied in depth, that you could argue were disenfranchised in some way because they were given the wrong candidates to vote for. And again, if you want to go back to comparing apples to apples, that's 600 cases per million ballots versus 5 cases of voter fraud or impersonation. So why aren't we looking at what went wrong there? Why aren't we talking about ways that we can clean up the voter rolls so that an investigation about voter fraud in North Carolina could move forward with more ease? I was talking to Jay Delancey, who is the leader of the Voter Integrity Project. They're like on the exact opposite side of this issue as we were. And I was saying, Jay, one thing I think we really agree on is that researchers, people who are interested in looking into this problem, need to have better data to use, because we don't want to make mistakes based on the data we're using and, prove or show that there's more fraud than there is based on some errors in our research. And he agreed with me that, he said they had trouble matching voters when they were looking into what they thought were illegal votes being cast. So why aren't we making an investment in our election infrastructure? Why did the legislature reject $4 million of federal money through the Help America Vote Act in 2012 to train our poll workers better, to make sure that all the county board of elections have a laptop at the polling places. Why are we rejecting help for improving those things and really taking time to look into what kind of fraud is out there, if any? Because to me, that's much smarter public policy, and I think taxpayers would appreciate that far more than spending potentially millions of dollars on something that in the end might not even prevent the very thing we were trying to prevent.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, you know, from a perspective to see what the lawmakers care about when they are passing these supposed, you know, election integrity bills. We predict that they're not going to tackle absentee voting, and a reason for that might be that many elderly people vote absentee, many of all parties, and yet that's not really an issue that the leadership seems to want to engage deeply in, though there is some talk that they'll have some absentee voting measure. And also there's the issue when you're talking about the long lines at the polls. The reality is it's going to happen at precincts that have more voters of color and more low-income voters. And so you can really see a clear disparity when people have to take additional steps, you know, even if it's doing the signature requirement and saying, I'm going to sign this affidavit to say I am who I say I am. That's happening more at precincts that traditionally have been have voters who have experienced a long history of disenfranchisement, and I don't think that's a law that really any advocates for, you know, fair legal elections can get behind.
Other questions in the back?
Why is it so hard to find people who are negatively affected by this? Why don't we have like the names of thousands of people in every state who are going to be turned away?
I think part of the challenge, first, if you can find people who are impacted in this way, not all of them want to be the face of a campaign like this. We have contacts with people in North Carolina through some very intense organizing that we've done of people who say, yeah, I'm impacted and I vote, but I don't want my face on, you know, the television. I can't come to Raleigh to be part of this public hearing. So, I mean, first, I think they're out there and we can find them, and it's just a matter of, you know, wanting to participate. Second, it's hard to find people who fall through the system because they fall through the system. So, you know, it's challenging for that reason. And, you know, people make the argument on the pro-voter ID side that the people you're talking about, if they're that disenfranchised, they're not going to vote anyway. Maybe, but that's not a reason for us to pass laws that make it harder for them to vote. We're supposed to be facilitating voting and making sure that everyone who wants to participate has that opportunity to do so. So it's not a great answer to your question, but I think that tells part of that story.
So, given that the General Assembly is probably going to pass something...
Speak up a little bit.
What? Given that the General Assembly is going to pass something probably, what is the best case scenarios? Or, I guess alternatively, what could you live with?
You want to go first?
Well, I mean, our best case scenario is no voter ID,
Yeah.
period. And short of that, I mean, we don't really see that there's a acceptable or even you know, appropriate solution to a problem that doesn't really exist. However, what we would, if we have to see a voter ID bill, it, you know, is a necessity that it contains a signature requirement. So in lieu of voter ID, you can sign and say you are who you say you are. We also don't want, or many advocates don't want a bill that requires a second trip to the Board of Elections. It has to be a one trip, you sign, you say you are who you say you are, and that's the end of the story, because all these voters, I mean, often they can't find the time to come back to the polls or go to a different location than they were in the first place, like going from your precinct to the local Board of Elections. So in an ideal world, there would be no voter ID bill. If it's short of ideal, we would like to see a signature alternative.
we're in alignment with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice on that. And some other questions that we think the legislators should be thinking about are, what are your acceptable ID requirements? The first bill that they passed was photo ID only, and there were 8 types of government issued ID that you could present. And that did not include, by the way, student IDs from universities like Duke, because Duke is private and UNC is public. UNC's student ID would qualify as government issued, but Duke's would not. So we're saying if you're gonna accept student ID from any accredited college or university in the state, not just public universities. Second, if you're really concerned about the elderly or senior citizens, are you going to accept expired ID? If you accept expired ID, how does that help prevent voter fraud? But whatever. You know, I think how do you treat, again, the piece of how you treat the voter who shows up and doesn't have ID, what are the steps someone has to go through to get the free ID? And another argument, again, that proponents of voter ID have made is this is good, because if people who don't have an ID now get a free ID through this process, then they have an ID. But I was looking back at the bill, and the 351, it specifically said in there that the free ID you would get could only be used for voting, so I don't see how that helps someone in their daily life. So if you're serious about that, then write into the bill that whatever ID is provided through the voting process can be used for other purposes. So these are all considerations that we're asking them to look into. Again, we would like not to see this happen at all, but at minimum, people should be able to sign a statement if they don't have ID, and they shouldn't have to come back twice.
Are there issues that your two groups disagree about in terms of voter ID?
It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe we don't do litigation strategy, and they're the lawyers and we're the organizers. I think our groups are probably aligned on many issues. I don't know of any off the top of my head.
Yeah, and there are many groups that are interested in this fight. You know, civic engagement groups that represent the people most likely to be disenfranchised. I mean, people have been coming to the table and saying that they don't want this bill. And the people who have been coming and saying that they support voter ID often are people from out of state who work for conservative think tanks. Not too many actual North Carolina constituency groups are clamoring for a voter ID law.
There are groups that are less willing and interested in having policy discussions about voter ID, sort of the perspective of it's gonna pass, so let's mitigate, let's make it the least bad bill we could possibly make it. There are groups that say, no, that's too much compromise, we don't need it at all. And there's been some tension because of that perspective, because there are other groups like disability rights and the AARP and other groups that have specific constituencies that might be more heavily impacted, who are going and lobbying and saying, let's make the burden a little bit less on this constituency or that. Yes?
Let's just assume that it passes. What's the legal strategy and organizing strategy after that?
Well, the legal strategy is going to depend on when they want to implement it. So there's talk that in 2013, if they pass it soon, there's talk that in 2013 it'll be optional. They'll ask for it, but it'll be optional, and you can vote as usual if you don't have it. And so 2014 will be the real year that you would actually experience harms if you don't have voter ID and you go to the polls. In terms of organizing, do you want to talk about that?
Well, I think we would turn to public education about what you have to have. We would have multiple organizing strategies around this. So one would be bird dogging the government agencies that are supposed to be doing the public education themselves, because the track record on that is they have enough other things to do that they don't really ever get to the public education piece. So it comes down to civic groups like ours and others to do the voter education piece. So bird dogging that, doing some education ourselves, you know, printing lots and lots of flyers and posters and everything that we would need to get the word out. We organize in a lot of church communities and with other civic organizations and local groups on the ground. So we'd be working through our volunteer leaders and local coalitions to get the education out there. We would probably be helping to find plaintiffs if needed for whatever the legal strategy would be, since we have those connections in the community. So those are a couple examples of the ways that we would start gearing up for something like this.
Yeah, and I mean, as long as we have Section 5, then the state will have to submit this plan for pre-clearance to the Department of Justice or the DC Circuit Court, and it's our expectation that we'd participate in the commentary for that process and bring forward as much data as we can show about how this would disenfranchise voters of color. And then also, we have very strong state constitutional language about the right to vote on equal terms. It's even stronger than, arguably stronger than that in the federal Constitution. So I think, you know, you could expect to see state and federal claims related to the constitutional burdens on the right to vote. And then, like I talked about before, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act showing the impact that it has on people of color in a disproportionate way that discriminates against them.
Yes.
I would like to raise an issue in a broader picture. So I'm not an American and I'm not able to vote here, but in the last 2 presidential elections I drove voters, and as a European I was just completely astonished how little interest the groups you are especially concerned about have in going to vote. So I would receive every morning a list of people of color, people who, you know, live in the poorer parts of Durham to drive that day. On average, 4/5 of these people would not be at the house at the time that had arranged with them. And, you know, the idea was I drive them to vote and I drive them home. Mm-hmm. And that I found, you know, very surprising. Mm-hmm. So I just would like your comment about, you say, you know, we really have their interest in mind, and this is why we don't want a voter ID. So I just wonder, do they really care that much? Mm-hmm. And you know, don't take it in the wrong way. I find that a really, for a non-American, a surprising fact.
Yeah.
And the second thing, to go in your broader policy remarks, I also find it astonishing that you do not have independent voter commissions, or so in every European country, for example, you know, there is a independent organization that administers voting, makes sure whoever comes to vote is supposed to do that. Mm-hmm. On the other side, checks that electronic voting is really working. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, that's not the case, neither in North Carolina nor in most of the other states. Do you have some background information on that? Wouldn't that solve a whole lot of your problems?
2 good questions. To the first question, unfortunately, in this country, and especially in the South, we have a legacy of Jim Crow racism. Voter participation was the highest it's ever been in North Carolina, besides the 2008 election in the late 1800s, when a group of African-American Republicans joined some poor whites to develop something called the Fusion Coalition and rise up against what they saw as a corporate-dominated Democratic Party. They swept elections at every level of the state. Voter turnout was as close to 100% as it's ever been, and immediately they implemented reforms to open up the voting process and help people participate. That was quickly squashed in a very violent way by the Democrats in this state. And immediately after taking power back through a riot in Wilmington, intimidation at polls across the state, a very coordinated voter suppression campaign, they rolled back all the reforms that were won by the Fusionists. And ever since then, it's been an uphill battle to make people in this state, especially people of color and people who have been historically disenfranchised, feel like they have a right to participate. And they've been largely ignored and marginalized. That's a legacy that we have to deal with as a state. It's a legacy we have to deal with as a country that we've done a bad job with. There are just as many people who are white, middle class, affluent, who don't give a crap about elections. You know, they'd rather vote for an American Idol than go and show up at the polls. But they don't have, there's not a history of disenfranchising those groups. There's not a history of discrimination targeting those groups. So we don't talk about that as much. I would like us to really, in a bipartisan way, focus on really increasing participation to the levels that we see in other democratic countries across the world. I think we're doing ourselves a huge disservice by continuing to think it's okay that voter turnout in general is so bad in the United States. To the point about nonpartisan or independent election observers and administrators, I tend to agree with that. We want an independent redistricting commission in North Carolina. It's ridiculous that partisan invested people draw the lines to say who you get to vote for. These are the bigger, more fundamental shifts that we need in American democracy that we can't even begin to focus on if we're arguing about voter ID, if we're litigating voter ID for years after it passes. This is why we think this is such a waste of time, because we'd like to get to these deeper issues that are more at the root of participation problems in our country. Sorry.
Okay, well, thank you very much.